Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar, Natural Hazards Risk for Infrastructure in El Salvador. This is organized by the Climate and Development Knowledge Network together with the Government of El Salvador and ESA. I would like to tell you more about our network. The Climate and Development Knowledge Network works to change the quality of life for people most challenged by the effects of climate change. We aim to bridge climate change and development policy, enabling developing countries to achieve a low carbon and climate resilient future, along with poverty reduction and human development. CDKN support decision makers in government, the private and non-governmental sectors at national, regional, and global level in designing and delivering climate-compatible development. We do this by combining research, advisory services, and knowledge sharing in support of locally owned and managed policy processes. CDKN is a North-South alliance that brings together a wide range of expertise and experience. PricewaterhouseCoopers and the Overseas Development Institute in London, Lead Pakistan, Fundación Futuro Latinoamericano in Ecuador, and South-South-North in South Africa. Our team includes climate scientists, researchers, economists, consultants, and project managers, along with specialists in communication, knowledge management, and partnership building. CDKN offers a distinctive demand-led approach where decision makers determine the kind of support we provide, and we help align it with the broader context of development policies and planning. We link bottom-up to top-down, working at international, national, and subnational levels. Within the broad scope of climate-compatible development, we work across 4 strategic themes. The first is climate-compatible development policies and practice. The second is improving developing countries' access to climate finance. The third is strengthening resilience through climate-related disaster risk management. And the fourth is supporting climate negotiators from the least developed and most climate vulnerable countries. So thank you very much for joining again. This webinar of natural hazard risk for infrastructure in El Salvador will be hosted by Timothy Webb and Selina Catan, together with me, Maria Jose Pacha, and Daniela Contreras. So next slide, please. So we are going to be the facilitators with my colleague Daniela. We are the knowledge and management team for the Climate and Development Knowledge Network in Latin America and the Caribbean. And here there are some logistics and frequently asked questions. Today's presentation will be recorded and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, and you will receive the link after the webinar. There are also 2 options for listening to this session. One is through plugging into your computer and the other via telephone that was provided in your registration message. Please close all extra browsers to make the most of this tool. Questions are very welcome, so please write them in the question section that you can find in the toolbar on your GoToWebinar screen. We will try to answer them as possible in the time available at the end of the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties, please send a chat message to me or Daniela, and we will try to sort it out. Please answer the polls and surveys during and after the webinar, as they will help us in understanding more your needs. So thank you to the speakers, and we will introduce them now. Next, please. So Tim Webb is the area leader for disaster risk reduction at ESA Technologies in Canada, where he works closely with the climate change adaptation team. Tim brings together a background in natural hazard risk assessment with practical experience in emergency management to develop tools and analysis for forecasting hazard consequences and assessing risk. He is an analyst, simulation modeler, and emergency management professional with more than 35 years of experience designing, developing, and deploying decision support tools. Selina Catal is the Director of Environmental Observatory in El Salvador. She has led the evaluation and analysis of disaster risk at both national and local level, has a master's degree in natural hazard mitigation in structural engineering and geological hazard specializations. So we have a very experienced team here, And both Tim and Selena are part of a wider team that have developed this assessment, the results that will be presented here. We have Luis as well, Luis Menjivar, Griselda Barrera, Lorena Grande, Mario Sorto, and Jimena Eizaguirre as part of the team as well. So thank you for you to providing this information. Next, please, Danny. So it will be great now if you can tell us a little bit more about you, so we know you, our audience. Please, can you answer to this all online? Thank you. So it would be good for us to know if you're a researcher, a student, a government representative, a climate change professional, or an NGO representative. So we can tailor this webinar to your needs. Great, so I'm sharing the results. We have a climate change professional, researcher, and NGO representative audience. So thank you very much for you to be here. So we're going to continue with the presentation. Next, please. Great, so we'll give the floor to Selena. Thank you, Selena. I think that Selena is on mute.
Okay. Hi, hello everyone. I would like to start by thanking the Climate Development and Knowledge Network and the SOSA Consortium for its contribution to the project and for helping us develop this natural hazard risk for infrastructure in El Salvador. I will start with a brief introduction of our country and the hazards it's subjected to. Okay, El Salvador is the smallest and most densely populated country in Central America, with 69% of its 6 million people living in cities. In 2010, the UNDAC recognized El Salvador as one of the most vulnerable countries in the world, with 90% of the territory located in areas of high risk to natural disasters. According to the IPCC, in its fifth assessment report, note that Central America has traditionally been characterized as a region with high exposure to geoclimate hazards derived from its location and topography and with high vulnerability of its human settlements. It has also been identified as the most responsive tropical region to climate change. The Central American region is particularly vulnerable to the effect of climate change and has experienced in recent decades two hydrometeorological events with substantial implication for sustainable development. In Central America, there is ample evidence of climate variability at different scales, from intra-seasonal variability to long-term climate change increases, long-term seasonal variability to long-term. Climate change increases the variability of climate rainfall patterns with a more influential systems of the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic, more heavy rains, events of excess rain or lack of rain. Extreme weather events are prominent climate-related risks where many experiences have been gathered. In particular, extreme rainfall and droughts have had devastating impacts in the past decades. Next, please. Okay, in this slide, we can see the impacts of the extreme events that we have had in the past and how it had affected different sectors. For example, in the 2001 earthquakes, it was actually two earthquakes in 2001, a subduction zone and an upper crustal quake, and it generated a lot of damage and high economic losses. We can see how it affected both social production, infrastructure, environment, and other sectors. After that, the Hurricane Mitch, which occurred in 1998, had also great impact, and it transformed basically everything that we do right now for hazard monitoring, and it brought into the attention why hazard and risk analysis was so important to the country, and how it can contribute to make important decisions. In 2005, we had a volcanic eruption in Santa Ana volcano, and after that, a big storm that caused a huge lahar, and it also had great effects in different sectors. Next, please. Okay. Next, please. Okay, here we can see some pictures of the latest. Okay. We can see some picture of the previous events. In 2009, we had Ida, which was a low pressure associated to the hurricane, which broke all records of rain in 6 hours in the San Vicente volcano. We had more than 300 millimeters in that area, and it caused a huge lahar, which killed more than 300 people in that region. It also caused a very huge, very big flooding, very important flooding in the area. Another important event, an extreme rainfall event, occurred in 2011. It was the Tropical Depression 12E, and the accumulated rainfall was on the order of 762 millimeters, which is 42% of the annual average in just 10 days. Here are some pictures of that, and also of the landslide that we had during the 2001 earthquakes in Las Colinas, which was, this is the first image, which was one of the biggest landslides that we have ever had. It killed also, most of the people that died during that event were killed because of this landslide. Next, please. Okay, why this type of analysis is important to us. For us, risk assessment is not just to have some extra documents in our pockets. Risk assessment is used to provide decision-making tools for risk reduction. With risk assessment, we can implement, or we can give some guidance for corrective management, prospective management, which is directly related to disaster prevention, but also for disaster preparedness, which is related to reactive management and financial protection. The results of this type of studies can help in different areas. For example, with the risk assessment, we can identify critical infrastructure, and we can make detailed analysis for possible reinforcement and retrofit measures, which is actually a corrective measurement. Maybe the initial results are not detailed enough to make corrective measurements, but it can give us some guidance to prioritize infrastructure and to conduct this more detailed analysis where we can actually do something. With the individual components, for example, the hazard and site condition analysis, the identification of construction practices, the vulnerability of the building types, we can start to assess what our main problems are, and we can make specific investigation, for example, building codes and land use plans. And also the analysis of risk and its individual components with the critical infrastructure, the risk scenarios can provide us with important information for real-time risk maps and response plans, which are a great tool for emergency preparedness and response. Okay, we also think it is very important to make this an iterative analysis. Even in countries with robust risk management policies, major disaster can still cause important budget shocks, greatly affecting the country's economy and fiscal position. and triggering additional social and environmental impacts, increasing existing vulnerabilities and thusly adversely affecting sustainable development. Risk financing strategies should ensure government and public access to financial protection and should bring together ministries of finance and other government agencies involved in disaster prevention and preparedness in an effort to improve countries' overall financial resilience. So with the risk assessment, we can set a risk reduction goal, identify actions based on a cost-benefit analysis, and for those actions, for those assets that cannot be, where its vulnerability cannot be reduced, we can set financial protection goals. And then we can iterate this and make another risk assessment and with time improve the overall risk of the country. This study, this report, it is important to us for both the civil protection system, which mandates the ministry to conduct a risk and vulnerability analysis to provide information for decision making, but it's also a great tool to identify critical infrastructure and the effects of this that this damage or losses during an event may have, and how the country can prepare to reduce these losses. It is an important tool for the newly developed loss and damage mechanism for the convention. And I think this will provide important information for decision making on the country's critical infrastructure.
Well, great. Thank you, Selena, for this overview of El Salvador. And now Tim will present the results of this interesting study. So Tim, the floor is yours. Next slide, please, Danny.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Selena, and thanks, Maria Jose, for this opportunity, and hello to everyone. What I want to do now is get into a little bit more detail on this project for the next 10 or 15 minutes. I'm not going to dive very deeply into the details of the methodology, but I will give some background on how we went about doing this analysis, an overview of some of the results of the analysis, and what these can mean. Selena's already given us some good outlines of how this type of analysis can be used. So this project was driven by two main objectives. The first one is the more technical one and defines the scope of the project. It's a national level study focusing on infrastructure, looking at a range of different natural hazards. So this is a very broad scope. Quite often when we look at doing risk studies, people tend to focus in on single hazard types or focus in on smaller, more data-rich areas. We wanted to examine the pattern of risk across the whole country, looking both at hydrometeorological events that are going to be affected by climate change, but also at all other types of hazards as well. So we looked at volcanic hazards and seismic hazards and other types of hazards as well as those hydrometeorological events, because we wanted to put together an overall context for risk and disaster risk assessment in El Salvador. The second objective is focusing more on how do we make this a sustainable program going forwards. Many studies, unfortunately, end up just being completed and being put on the shelf, and they may be very interesting, but we feel it's very important that this type of analysis is built into a sustainable framework, meaning both a framework for the analysis part and the actual mechanics of doing the analysis and bringing the data together, but also the people part of the people being involved from different ministries and different agencies and networking, and making this actually an integral part of the way that information flows and the way decisions are made. Next slide. Selena already mentioned some of these, but this is sort of the why of why are we looking at quantifying risk across the country, and what sorts of things can we do to help us with policy making and decision making. So the primary one in some ways is what level of financial exposure does the key infrastructure in El Salvador have to different hazards? What is the pattern across the country? How big is that exposure? Looking at financial protection and resilience measures, just how large is the exposure of infrastructure in El Salvador. Climate change is an important aspect of this. Just how big an influence will changing climate have on some of these hazards, things like landslides and flooding, and how large are those changes going to be in comparison to the exposure that we have from other hazards. As Celia mentioned, we're looking at identifying vulnerable and critically vulnerable infrastructure. How can we prioritize that? How can we assign funds and for both analysis and mitigation to help to mitigate that? So starting from the larger context that we're talking about here and then diving down into more detailed analyses. What additional steps can be taken to manage risk? So what are the opportunities that appear as we start looking in more detail at the various different types of infrastructure that are exposed? Are there opportunities to look specifically at some of those and have some high benefit actions happen in the relatively short term? And then finally, how can we take natural hazard risk into account in planning? How can we provide better information for planners looking forwards? Quite often, planning decisions are made by municipal, city level governments. They aren't necessarily informed by the best available information on natural hazards and natural hazard risk. So how can we provide that information to people planning at that level? Next slide. So what did we do in our project? We started out by doing a stakeholder analysis, looking at all the various people involved across mostly government agencies and ministries, bringing them together, determining who had information, who had an interest in the results of this type of analysis. Then we spent a significant amount of time developing the information base for this project. So that's both developing the information on the hazard scenarios, a lot of which came from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment, and then also pulling together information on infrastructure. In El Salvador, like many countries, the information is spread quite widely through different ministries and agencies, and it isn't always easy to pull that information together. So we spent a significant amount of time identifying the key people, making sure we had appropriate permissions to have that data, and pulling that data together in a series of meetings and follow-ups. Once we had those two atlases, those portfolios of hazards and infrastructure, we brought those together into our risk analysis, and then we are now at the point of presenting the results of that analysis. This is basically the end of the first year of the project that we're talking about now. It's taken us a little over 12 months to get from the start to where we are now. As Selena mentioned, there's a lot more to do in sort of in increasing some of the information content of this and communicating the results. So what you're seeing is, in some ways, an interim result where we want to build on that. Next slide. So the risk analysis methodology that we used is a fairly typical one. We start out building up a set of hazard scenarios, both different hazard types, so seismic hazards, landslide hazards, flooding, and so forth. But also different intensities of hazard within those. So for example, in the seismic hazards, we build up a set of different levels of intensities of shaking. For floods, we have different flooding levels. And with each of those, we associate different probabilities, return intervals, how likely is it that those scenarios are going to happen. The second piece is the inventory data. So again, pulling data together from all of the various ministries. Where is that inventory? Where are those specific components of infrastructure? Those schools, those hospitals, substations, and so forth. And how are they valued? What are they worth? So if one of those was destroyed in a natural hazard event, what would it cost to replace that? We then combine that with a set of vulnerability relationships. So using information from international standards and from previous studies in El Salvador and Central America. We built up a set of damage curves that look at the intensity of a particular hazard and how much damage it would cause. So, for example, there's the lower curve there is looking at a depth damage curve. So this is just an example. Given how deep the water is from a particular flooding event, the amount of damage it would cause to a particular component of infrastructure. And then we combine all those things together to form our estimate of risk. Next slide. So the measure of risk that we chose was average annual loss. So the average annual loss is the expected loss per year averaged over many years. The thing with disasters, of course, is they don't occur every year. Some years there will be almost no damage, and then other years, perhaps when there's a major earthquake or a major tropical depression or hurricane, there's going to be much higher levels of damage. So what we calculate is the average annual loss, the amount that averaged over very many years. That allows us to compare across different hazard types. So some hazard types which occur quite frequently versus others such as volcanic eruptions, for example, which may only occur every few hundred years. It also allows us to compare across multiple infrastructure types because we're looking at average annual loss calculated in dollar terms. How much will it cost to replace that piece of infrastructure? So having this single measure gives us a way of combining all of these different infrastructure types and hazard types into a single uniform way of looking at things. This also relates directly to the financial implications. So in terms of financial protection measures, which could include disaster risk financing and things like that, this gives us a number that we can start to use to relate to some of those decisions. We do have enough data in the existing study and that we pulled together from the various ministries and agencies in order to be able to calculate the average annual loss for the selected infrastructure and natural hazards. It's conceptually very simple. We just simply sum the expected damage across all of these types measured in dollars. It is a little tricky given the different data types that we have. One of the problems with trying to take this broad look across the country and across different hazard types is the data is quite variable and wasn't always intended for the purposes we're using it. So we had to do some analysis to make the data into the format that we could use in the analysis. Next slide. So these are the hazards that we considered: landslides, floods, tsunamis, earthquakes, and various volcanic and volcanic-related events like lahars. As I mentioned in the previous slide, we have different types of information that we brought together. So we used susceptibility categories for landslides. We had flooding extents from an analysis carried out by Marn of historical flooding extents from previous events. And we used information from a previous earthquake study that looked across the whole country. For volcanic natural hazards, we used a set of scenarios that have been pulled together by various groups, especially by the Ministry of Natural Resources. And in total, we ended up with over 100 different scenarios for different types of natural hazards. Next slide. So one of the outcomes of this, and perhaps this can feed directly into planning, as I mentioned earlier on, is simply an atlas, a hazard atlas. So all of this information is pulled together in a GIS. It's fairly readily available, and people can look at any given location in the country and see what types of hazards they're exposed to. So the examples here just show tsunami exposure on the top left there. You can see along the coastline the different levels of brown there that represent the exposure to natural hazards, to tsunamis, and then a couple of examples of ashfall in different areas from different volcanoes. So El Salvador is not actually an island. I apologize for making the area blue all the way around. The coastline is just along the bottom part of the country there. And then we have flooding susceptibility, and we also have landslide categories. So you can see there that landslide risk is high around a lot of the volcanoes, as you would expect. El Salvador is built very much on a series of volcanoes, which makes it very high risk for landslides and other volcanic impacts. Next slide. So what infrastructure did we consider? So this infrastructure was again pulled together from various different ministries. Roads and highway bridges, big piece of the critical infrastructure. You can see there an indication of how many and how much infrastructure we're looking at. So we included about 3,000 kilometers of roads in the study. That's all of the primary roads and the secondary national routes. A total of about 1,500 highway bridges. Again, with flooding and landslides being such a big issue in El Salvador, the bridges can be particularly vulnerable, and severing those bridges can have high impacts. We collected information on transmission towers and electrical substations for the high voltage transmission, almost 1,000 healthcare facilities, more than 6,000 educational facilities, schools spread across the whole country, and more than 700 different water and sewer infrastructure components. So that includes things like large things like water and sewage treatment plants, but also smaller things like pumps and water storage tanks and things like that. We also included hydroelectric dams, airports and marine ports. Airports and marine ports in particular are large and quite complex pieces of infrastructure with a lot of different buildings, a lot of different components. So while we included those in the analysis, we haven't included those in the summaries. They really deserve to have a more detailed study that focuses directly on those particular components. We know that we don't have a complete inventory of all information for infrastructure across the country. There is some high voltage transmission infrastructure that is managed by other companies, other organizations that isn't included, and there are some hospitals that are managed by a different organization that aren't included here. Next slide. In order to pull all the analysis together, there are a couple of key things that we had to, a couple of key parameters that we had to estimate, and I just thought I would highlight those since they can have an influence on the end results. The first one relates to hazards and is the return interval. So how likely is it that a particular hazard will occur? So if a landslide's in a particular area, what's the probability of a landslide happening in any given period? And for tsunamis, similarly, how likely is a tsunami of a different size? So for some of these, like tsunamis, we had historical information to base them on. Landslides, we used historical observations of landslides, aerial photography, and other records that were collected after major events. Landslides tend to be associated in El Salvador with earthquakes and to a lesser extent with major weather events. But in other cases, particularly the volcanic scenarios, we had to use expert judgment in order to get to these return intervals, sitting down with the experts and figuring out in El Salvador and figuring out what were reasonable probabilities for the different hazards. The second piece of information is one which we can definitely improve over time, and that's how much is the various pieces of infrastructure worth? What would it cost to replace them? So for some of those pieces of infrastructure, for example, the educational facilities, the schools, the ministries provided us with specific information on the value of each of those schools and what it would cost to replace them. But for other examples, for instance, the roads and hospitals, we didn't have that specific information, at least available to us in the study. It may be available in the future, and that's certainly something we want to work on. In those cases, we used types of facilities. So we divided the hospitals up by the type, whether it was a national hospital, what size it was, and so forth, and assigned typical values to each of those types of facilities. Next slide. So I'm just going to go through and look at a few examples of some of the results. There are many different ways to sum up and to disaggregate the results. So this is just going to give you an example of a few of those ways that we can present these things. So the first thing to pay attention to on this slide is the number at the bottom there, $35.5 million. That basically says that in our analysis, that for the infrastructure that we included and for the natural hazards that we included, that's the average annual loss that we would expect every year. So that means from a financial protection point of view or from investing in mitigation, that's the number that we're looking at that should be considered. $35.5 million a year. We know that this is only a portion of the whole national exposure. We're not including commercial infrastructure, for example. We're not including the residential building stock, and we're not including some of the secondary effects, at least at this point, to the impacts to the economy and so forth. So this is only a piece of the overall exposure of El Salvador. You can see that the biggest single component, the biggest single natural hazard contribution to this loss, this risk, is from earthquakes. And that makes sense both from a historical point of view, looking at the magnitude of losses that have been observed in the past few decades. And also, as I mentioned before, El Salvador is very exposed to earthquakes. There are a lot of, it's built right along, or it's right along a subduction zone. There are numerous volcanoes, and the soils are also such that they can amplify shaking significantly. The second biggest hazard is from floods, both from some of those, mostly from some of those larger events that Selena mentioned at the beginning. Other things like the pyroclastic surges and flows from volcanoes and tsunamis are smaller. They're obviously very important in specific areas. Along the coastline, for example, tsunamis can have a very large component of the overall risk. But when you look at the whole country, they're a smaller component. Next slide. This is just slicing the results the other way, if you like, looking at which infrastructure components are contributing the most to this loss. And the biggest single component there, the 14.4 million, is coming from education facilities. This makes sense. The education facilities are scattered across the whole country. There's a large number of them, as we saw, and frequently they're built perhaps a little less to be a little less resilient to hazards like earthquake shaking, and some of them are certainly in locations where they're vulnerable to flooding and landslide events, where perhaps some of the other larger infrastructure components like hospitals and highways and so forth, electrical substations have been built to be out of the way of some of those hazards. So education is a big one. If you add together the highways and the highway bridges together, they're quite a significant component. So the transportation infrastructure is probably the second largest here. Next slide. So we can also look at specific areas. This is looking at one area along the coast, the lower Rio Lempa River area. This is an area that's exposed to both floods coming down the rivers from above, Rio Lempa River from above, and tsunamis from the ocean side, from the subduction zone earthquakes and from distant telegenic tsunamis. This simply shows the color coding for how at risk the different components are. So the small triangles are for the different schools, and they show how exposed they are to tsunamis. So quite straightforward. You can see that the roads, for example, along the outer coastline there, you can see the color coding where they're orange. Those are the most exposed to the tsunami hazard. They have the highest average annual loss, the highest risk. But even though it's a relatively simplistic thing, this sort of information can be used for planning. It can be used for public education and so forth. Next slide. We can also roll things up by some of the jurisdictional boundaries. This is just looking at average annual loss in each of the municipalities across El Salvador. Interestingly, there isn't a very strong pattern here. We might have expected, the highest average annual loss to be in some of the more dense urban areas like San Salvador. But this actually makes sense again if you look at the fact that a large component of the infrastructure that's contributing to the average annual loss for the whole country is from schools and highways and highway bridges, and those are dispersed throughout the whole country. There are many other ways of looking at this data, and I'm just showing you just a few of these right now, just to show the examples of the type of thing that we can do. Next slide. This is an example of the sort of information that we can give to a particular ministry. So this is looking at Ministry of Health and the hospitals. So we looked at the 30 major hospitals across the country, and we looked at the total average annual loss from all hazards. So the highest risk hospitals are the ones that we're showing here. So you can actually rank the hospitals in terms of the level of financial risk they're exposed to. Again, we're just looking at financial risk here. We're not looking at other types of risk, which I'll talk about in a little while. But this allows you to prioritize future studies and work. So if you're going to start looking at where to spend money on doing further risk assessments or site-specific work, this helps you to focus in on that most critical infrastructure and to rank that. And we can do this in the same way for schools and for other infrastructure. Next slide. We didn't model the details of the effects of changing climate in our analysis. We didn't have the sufficient information to modify the probabilities of those different types of hazards, but certainly there are ways in which changing climate will affect the results of this type of study. Increasing intensities and frequencies of tropical storms, depressions, can certainly lead to higher frequencies of flooding. Which will increase that flooding pie in the chart there, that segment of the pie, so making it more significant. And also, more intense events can potentially lead to wider extents of flooding. And so, the flood mapping that we have is based on historical data. It's possible that as time progresses, we'll see floods that are more extensive than the ones we have included, and that will include a greater, potentially include a greater range of infrastructure. Intense rainfall events can increase the probability of landslides and lahars. Landslides and lahars didn't come out as to be a very large component of the overall contribution to average annual loss and risk in our study. It's certainly very significant for residential areas in some of those high density areas of the country. But because they tend to be in very specific areas and relatively contained, they don't have a large impact on the infrastructure that we have in our system. And finally, just another example, even though tsunamis themselves aren't influenced by changing climate, rising sea levels and changes in coastal vegetation can increase the vulnerability of facilities and buildings to tsunamis. So there are potential mitigation opportunities there as well in changing the vulnerability of buildings to tsunamis. Next slide. So this is sort of a little bit of a different look at some of the same things that Selena brought up at the beginning. So given that we have this type of quantified risk assessment information, what can we do about that? What can governments do about that? So one thing we can do, starting on the right-hand side there, is reduce the vulnerability of facilities. So obvious things here are things like seismic upgrading or raising key components of buildings so that they're not affected by floods, moving things to upper stories, that type of thing. Moving on around, we can potentially reduce the exposure of facilities. We can move them if it's possible. We can construct dikes and berms, that type of thing. We can look at in coastal areas where coastal flooding and tsunamis are an issue. We can look at vegetation and other green approaches to reducing the exposure of those facilities, especially to wave damage. We can increase the resilience of the services. So this is stepping back a little bit from the buildings themselves or the specific pieces of infrastructure and saying, well, we can have redundant infrastructure so that if one piece fails, we have some redundancy, which increases the resilience. We can have failover plans and other management procedures in place so that when pieces of the infrastructure do fail, that is not so, doesn't have such a great impact on the overall country and economy. We can also decrease recovery times and costs by having equipment caches where that's possible and plans to rapidly respond to those key pieces of infrastructure that have the biggest impact. And then finally, we can also look at managing financial risk, so looking at things like disaster risk financing. When it's not possible to reduce the risk in other ways, how can we offset that by being part of other facilities that are becoming more popular in the region. Next slide. So what did we learn in doing this study? So the first two there really focus on people, and I think it's critical to look at this. We tend to focus very much on the analytical components and how the data comes together and the equations and so forth, but this sort of study doesn't work unless we have broad participation from a wide range of people, and we need to develop the networks of people across ministries and within ministries so that information can flow well. Without the right people being involved and staying involved and continuing to network and feed information in multiple directions, both the information that's gathered by ministries and agencies being fed into the group that's doing the analysis and the results being fed back out. Without that, these pieces won't be effective in influencing decision making. The third point there, not a big surprise, but it's quite possible for information and supporting documentation from studies to become lost inside of ministries. And that's something we were very keen to avoid in this situation. People move on, people retire, and it can be hard to track down sometimes where information is, what it is exactly, how it was collected, and that type of thing. So having that network of people being involved and trading the information and keeping it alive can help to avoid that type of situation. And finally, I think our first approximations of risk that we've carried out here are already useful, but we feel it's really critical to move this along and refine them further. There's more information that needs to be gathered from ministries. There's more information that can be provided back to ministries, and that simply takes time. So we've only had, as I mentioned, a year so far doing this, and that working with people and really taking this to the next level is going to take some more time. Next slide. So what are our next steps? Well, we've very much focused so far on this financial measure of average annual loss and tying that to just the rebuilding costs. We're very aware that we need to look at a broader range of both socioeconomic impacts, looking at things like the network impacts. If you remove water, for example, or power, that then has impacts on hospitals and so forth and schools. So looking at those network impacts and looking at indirect economic impacts, which haven't been included so far. Those will clearly greatly increase the overall level of risk, the overall level of financial exposure. Yes. So second point there, we want to identify the key components with the highest risk for further review and analysis, and we want to work with ministries on that to both narrow down, looking at particular pieces of infrastructure, particular site-specific pieces. Look at that high priority infrastructure, both to look at specific examples where we can start to do cost-benefit analysis and start to look at what the best way forward is for that high-risk infrastructure, but also to validate some of the other work that we've done, to look at the assumptions that we've used in our assessment. And then the second piece is to keep our wide view across the whole country. So many ministries and agencies collect information every year or periodically about their infrastructure. They have censuses, they gather information about, for schools, for example, how many rooms, how many teachers, that type of thing. We feel that by adding a relatively small number of questions to those censuses, we can get a lot more information that's useful for doing this sort of national level assessment of natural hazard risk. So by adding half a dozen or even less specific questions to the censuses for schools and hospitals, for example, we feel that we can do a much better job in the future in terms of assessing risk. And that's all. Great, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. It's been very interesting. And Danny, if you put the next slide, thank you. So we have some questions here for the audience that we would like to share with you, and please, Tim, if you can answer them. We have a question by Oscar. You know that there is a close relationship between climate change adaptation and risk mitigation. Can the framework based on a risk management perspective be fitted into a climate change perspective?
Yes, I think it can. I think the two things are very closely related. When we're looking at the pulling out the hazards and the risk associated with hydrometeorological events, that can feed directly into climate change adaptation. So looking at, for example, in our study, we can start to look at what schools, what hospitals are exposed to floods and landslides and so on, and we can start zeroing in on those schools and looking at specific mitigation activities that we would want, adaptation and mitigation activities that we would want to apply. So just to clarify, when I use the word mitigation, I'm speaking as a disaster risk person. So I mean doing things to the school or to the hospital to reduce the risk to that specific facility.
Okay, great, thank you. We have also another question by Mike Savonis. He says, as you note, the use of average annual loss as a risk measure depends on the probability of the event occurring. Did your analysis look at future probabilities that are affected by climate change, or was it restricted to the historical probabilities? If you looked at future probabilities, how did you estimate them?
So we just used existing probabilities, the historical probabilities in our analysis right now, and we took a sort of an informal look at how those probabilities would change with climate change, but we didn't incorporate that directly into the analysis. We can certainly point at, to the direction in which we expect probabilities to go. So we would expect, landslides associated with severe storms to increase. We would expect the flood frequency based on existing information to potentially increase, but we didn't actually put in specific numbers for doing that. We can certainly do that. Our framework is set up so it's possible for us to relatively easily change probabilities and rerun the analysis and to see how that would change.
Great, thank you. And looking into the future, we have Oriol that has a question. Is regarding future climate information and future climate scenarios. Is there available for El Salvador such information in a regional scale? Regional climate models and not only global models?
I did not look into that in detail. I'm not sure if Selena perhaps could answer that question better than me. We didn't find specific regional predictions that we could use easily to zero in on specific probabilities. Certainly in directions of things, increased intensity of rainfall events and things like that. But in terms of specific numbers we could use, we didn't include those. Selena, can you answer that question any better?
Okay. Can I add something? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Also, we do have regional climate change scenarios. The thing is, the climate change scenarios usually present the mean conditions that we may expect in a period of time. We do not have scenarios of how the frequency of the extreme events may change, and we do not have the scenarios of how these extreme events may become more extreme. So for this type of analysis, I mean, common climate change scenarios are really not of much use. The analysis that Tim has conducted, I mean, it's like he said, from a broad perspective of how, when these frequencies of these return periods may change due to climate change, how we can expect these flooding events and these landslides to increase, and how it might change the proportion of the infrastructure that is exposed to these hazards, and the type of hazards that may affect more. I think that's what.
Okay, thank you. We have a question here of Andres. Will you be covering mechanisms or instruments used to transfer risk from these climate change effects, for instance, insurance, shared risk, social protection, into land development planning at the national or local level?
That's outside of the scope of this study, really, but I don't know if Selena, if you wanted to comment on that one too. I think the general answer is yes. That's exactly the type of thing that needs to be considered, and that the Cabinet for Sustainability, which has just been formed relatively recently in El Salvador, I think that's exactly the type of things that they would be looking at.
Okay, wonderful. And we have the last question by Ignacio Aguirre. I will, sorry if we cannot answer all your questions. There are several studies in El Salvador related to natural disasters and with the management of the coastal area in general. Have you taken these studies into account in this project development?
Yeah, so we part of the study was looking at the existing studies for tsunamis and for flooding and other things, especially in the coastal area there. As you say, there's some quite detailed work. We took what we could from those studies and used them in our framework. It wasn't always the information. The information didn't always fit nicely or easily from taking those studies, but we reviewed all of the information that was available.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much for your answers, Tim. Danny, can we share the next slide, please? So we would like to know whether we can add your mail into our CDKN list so you can receive our newsletter and also all the other news on products about this project. Okay, well, thank you very much for that. So thank you very much to Selina and to Tim, to Daniela, to being with me co-hosting this webinar. These are very interesting results, and we expect that they can inform decision making in the region. I will send you all the presentation and also this recording in the following emails. So thank you again. Thank you, Daniela, Luis, and Tim. If you want to say something.
Just thanks to everyone for listening, and thank you to the climate to the CDKN and to the ESA-WESA consortium for their help in this project, and everybody for their attention in this matter.
Yes, thanks to Selina and to Maria Jose as well for organizing all of this and working hard on our webinar today.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Watch this space for our next webinar. Thank you.